If you looked into the pocket of an average person on the street right now, there's a 99% chance you'd find a smartphone, a set of keys, and maybe a cheap plastic lighter, a Cricket or a Bic, bought with the change at a supermarket checkout. Disposable plastic junk that costs a couple of cents to make. You use it for 3 weeks, the liquefied isobutane runs out, or the little flint wheel falls off, and without a shred of guilt, you toss it into the nearest trash can, sending it off to a landfill to decompose over the next 300 years. But if you pick up a rectangular block of stamped brass that opens with that dry metallic click impossible to mistake for anything else on the planet, you're holding an object of an entirely different civilizational breed. An object born in the middle of the 20th century's greatest economic hell, that passed through the ashes of World War II, lit up the trenches of Vietnam, became a symbol of Hollywood cinema, and yet has barely changed in design over more than 90 years. And here a paradoxical question arises. In a world obsessed with planned obsolescence, where even flagship phones turn into bricks after 5 years, how did a simple gasoline lighter with a lifetime warranty not just survive, but turn into an industrial cult with a production run of more than 600 million units? To understand this, we have to set aside the glossy brochures for a moment and travel to a small provincial town in northern Pennsylvania, where in the early 1930s, people literally didn't know how they'd afford a loaf of bread. That town is called Bradford. The late 1920s to early 1930s. For context, Bradford was a typical American company town from the first oil boom. Back in the late 19th century, so-called Bradford crude was discovered here. Light, high quality, practically ideal for producing lubricating oils. The town grew rapidly, easy money flowed through it, and local oil barons built lavish mansions. But by the start of the Great Depression, the oil boom was fading, and the 1929 stock market crash finished off the local economy for good. Wells were mothballed, factories closed, unemployment soared. In this depressed little town lived a 40-year-old man named George Blaisdell, a man with a rather particular biography. Blaisdell couldn't stand school. He dropped out after 8th grade, telling his father he wouldn't spend another day at a desk. His father, a practical man and owner of the Blaisdell Machinery Company machine shop, sent his headstrong son to the shop floor to learn lathes and milling machines. There young George learned to feel metal, to understand tolerances, drivetrain mechanics, pressure forming, and, in practice, the strength of materials. After his father's death, Blaisdell and his brother tried running the family machine tool business, but sold it during World War I, invested the proceeds in oil, and by 1932 was left with practically nothing. His oil speculation had collapsed, the stock market was in ruins, his pockets were empty, and at home he had a family to feed. Then comes a warm, sultry summer evening in 1932. Local gentry, and those still trying to keep up appearances, gather on the veranda of the Bradford Country Club. Quiet music plays. Men in expensive dinner jackets discuss plummeting stock prices and drink bootleg whiskey, since Prohibition hasn't been repealed yet. Among them sits George Blaisdell and his old friend, local oilman Dick Dresser. Dresser decides to light a cigarette. From the pocket of his impeccably tailored trousers, he pulls out a strange, clumsy metal contraption, an Austrian-made Cyklon lighter. To light it, Dresser has to clamp the body between his knees or hold it in one hand while wrestling off, with visible effort, the massive brass cap covering the wick. The cap gives with a creak. Dresser strikes the wheel, lights his cigarette, and pulls the cap back on. Watching this absurd pantomime, Blaisdell smirks and says, "Listen, Dick, you seem like a decent man, well-dressed, in an expensive suit. Why don't you buy yourself a proper, handsome lighter instead of embarrassing yourself with that cheap 25-cent brass eyesore?" To which Dresser, exhaling a smoke ring, shrugs indifferently and says the phrase that turned Blaisdell's life upside down. "You know, George, it's ugly, sure, but it works." It works. Those two words held the entire heart of the problem. In the 1930s, the market for pocket fire starters was a sorry sight. There were either matches, which turned damp in your pocket at the slightest humidity and went out in any draft, or expensive desk and pocket lighters from luxury brands like Ronson, Dunhill, or Cartier. Those were beautiful, finished in enamel, silver, and gold, but cost a fortune, needed constant cleaning, and, crucially, blew out in the wind just like ordinary matches. The Austrian Cyklon lighter, which had appeared back in World War I thanks to an invention by Austrian chemist Karl Auer von Welsbach, who synthesized mischmetal, a pyrophoric alloy of cerium, lanthanum, and iron that threw off a shower of bright sparks when struck, was windproof. A perforated metal screen surrounded its wick. Air passed through the holes to sustain the burning of the gasoline vapor, but a direct gust of wind couldn't blow out the flame. Its ergonomics, however, were dreadful. The thin, cheap brass dented instantly, the lid dangled on a chain or simply got lost, and lighting it required both hands. Blaisdell, with a sharp entrepreneurial instinct and the hands of a first-rate machinist, seized on the idea immediately. His first thought was banal and purely commercial. Why invent something when you can just resell it? He contacted the Austrian manufacturers, secured exclusive rights to import Cyclone lighters into the United States, ordered a batch at 12 cents apiece, hoping to sell them for $1, gave the cases a bright chrome polish, and failed spectacularly. Even in the poverty of the Great Depression, the American consumer flatly refused to buy an awkward tin box whose lid had to be pried off with both hands, risking a sprained finger. Blaisdell couldn't sell practically a single unit. The warehouse filled up with unsold boxes while his last savings evaporated. And here is exactly the quality that separates a real engineer from an ordinary reseller. Blaisdell didn't give up, and he didn't file for bankruptcy. He sat down at his workbench. He took the Austrian lighter apart down to the last screw, laid the parts out on the table, and asked himself a simple question. How do you redesign this concept so the lighter can be operated with one hand, fits in your palm, the lid never gets lost, and the body can withstand any drop or mechanical stress? To start, Blaisdell rented a tiny basement space above the Rickerson and Pride auto repair shop and garage on Boylston Street in Bradford. Rent was just $10 a month. His equipment amounted to almost nothing: a couple of used metalworking benches, a hand-stamping press, a welder, and an old lathe bought for $800 borrowed from acquaintances. The new company's entire staff was 3 people: Blaisdell himself and 2 hired machinists. George began designing the case from scratch. The first thing he did was change the shape. The Austrian lighter was rounded and elongated. Blaisdell made the case a strict rectangle with rounded edges, sized to fit perfectly in a man's palm. The lighter had to sit comfortably in the hand and open with a single motion of the thumb. The second and most important decision was the hinged connection between lid and case. Blaisdell permanently joined the top lid to the bottom section with a tiny metal hinge. On the very first 1932 to 1933 prototypes, this hinge was external, made of 3 segments soldered onto the outside of the brass case. It let the user flip the lid back a full 180 degrees with a single flick of the finger, without letting go of the lighter. The third decision was splitting the design into 2 independent parts: an outer decorative/protective case and an inner functional unit, the so-called insert. The insert was a hollow metal shell matching the shape of the case. Inside it sat a reservoir tightly packed with cotton balls or rayon fiber that served as an absorbent. The cotton was soaked in liquid fuel, a light petroleum fraction, refined gasoline, or naphtha. A braided cotton wick snaked through this cotton, emerging through the insert's top plate straight into the windscreen. Below, the reservoir was sealed with a thick felt gasket that kept gasoline from leaking onto the owner's clothes and kept fuel vapor contained inside. But the most brilliant piece of mechanics, the one that created the magic of the object, was the spring-loaded cam lever, a cam positioned at the top of the insert next to the wick. Let's break this mechanism down because it hides a piece of pure engineering beauty. There are no latches or locks inside the lid at all. A flat or coiled spring is fixed at the base of the insert, pressing with constant force against a curved metal cam. When the lighter is closed, the top of the cam rests against an inner sloped plate of the lid, pressing it against the case and preventing it from accidentally opening in your pocket. But the moment you apply pressure with your thumb and start lifting the lid, the cam passes its point of dead resistance, the spring snaps straight, the cam jumps past the edge and strikes the inner wall of the lid with force, flinging it fully open. At that instant, the thin-walled brass lid acts like the resonator of an acoustic system. Metal strikes metal, the sound is amplified many times over by the cavity of the case, and out comes that legendary ringing click, clack, a sound the company would officially register as a sound trademark in 2018. Closing the lighter reverses the process. The cam again overcomes resistance. The lid snaps shut under spring pressure and covers the windscreen, cutting off oxygen to the wick. The flame instantly goes out, followed by a second, slightly duller latching click. No buttons, no batteries, no complex valves. 2 moving parts and 1 spring. Mechanical absoluteness. The next component that required enormous refinement was the windscreen wheel and shield. The windscreen was an oval metal collar around the wick with rows of round through holes. Blaisdell determined their number and diameter by trial and error. Early versions had 8 holes on each side, then he experimented with 7 and finally settled on the classic formula. 16 holes, 8 on each side. What's the physics behind this? When a crosswind hits the lighter, the solid airstream strikes the outer radius of the shield and is deflected. Only a small fraction of the air mass gets through the small round holes, creating microturbulence with reduced pressure inside the shield. There's plenty of oxygen to sustain the hydrocarbon oxidation reaction, but the airflow speed inside the shield drops to almost 0. The flame flickers but doesn't blow off the wick. To extinguish this lighter, you either had to cut off the air by closing the lid or blow straight down onto it with incredible force directly at the base of the wick. Next to the wick sat the flint tube. Inside a brass tube running the full length of the case, top to bottom, was a long coiled steel spring with a brass push piece on one end and an adjustment screw with a wide head on the other. The spring pressed a small cylinder of pyrophoric flint against the steel striker wheel with constant force. The wheel itself was made of high-carbon steel with a deep cross-hatched or angled knurl cut at 30 degrees, and underwent special heat treatment. The knurl on the wheel had to be hard enough to shave microparticles off the flint, yet not clog with lead cerium dust. One sharp flick of the finger across the wheel shaved off a stream of sparks heated to 1,000 degrees Celsius, flying straight into the base of the naphtha-soaked wick. Ignition happened instantly, in a fraction of a second. One question remained open: what to call this new device? Blaisdell had an excellent sense of timing. In the early 1930s, America was buzzing about another revolutionary invention, the slide fastener, which B.F. Goodrich brought to market under the punchy, futuristic brand name Zipper. The word zipper itself sounded fashionable, snappy, technological, associated with speed and the modern pace of life. George Blaisdell loved that sound. He started running through similar-sounding combinations: Zippo, Zippy, Zippette. In the end, he settled on a short, punchy, easy-to-remember word: Zippo. By late 1932, the first pre-production samples were ready, and in early 1933, Blaisdell officially registered the Zippo Manufacturing Company and filed a patent application. The U.S. Patent Office bureaucratically chewed on the paperwork for several years, and patent number 2,032,695 for a pocket lighter with windscreen and hinged lid wasn't granted to George Blaisdell until March 3, 1936. Until then, every lighter's bottom was stamped Zippo patent pending. Today, lighters bearing that stamp sell at auction for thousands of dollars. But inventing a brilliant product in the middle of an economic crisis is only 10% of success. The other 90% is managing to sell it to people who literally have no money for food. The first batch of 1933 Zippo lighters cost $1.95 apiece. In those days, that was serious money. $2 could buy a good pair of work boots or feed you for several days. In the first month of sales, January 1933, Blaisdell and his team managed to make and sell exactly 82 lighters. Revenue came to $159.90. After deducting material costs, rent, and wages for the two workers, the company posted a net loss. George was $33 in the red. People didn't want to hand over $2 for an unknown metal box. So Blaisdell made a marketing move that, at the time, looked like pure madness and business suicide. He announced an unconditional lifetime warranty on his product. It works, or we fix it free. Think about that wording. Not 1-year warranty with receipt and original packaging required. Not warranty against manufacturing defects subject to careful use. No, an absolute, total, lifetime guarantee. If your lighter broke, it didn't matter whether you'd run it over with a tractor, crushed it under a truck, found it at the bottom of a river 10 years later, or pulled it out of your grandfather's trunk. You simply put it in an envelope, mailed it to the factory in Bradford, Pennsylvania, and the factory's craftsman would repair it for free, replace the hinge, cam, spring, wheel, or fit a new insert, and mail it back at the company's expense, with a polite letter thanking you for using Zippo products. And across the company's nearly century-long history, not a single customer has ever paid a cent to repair an original Zippo lighter. This warranty manifesto instantly demolished buyer skepticism. For $2, a person wasn't just buying a fire starter. They were buying an object guaranteed to serve them for the rest of their life. Still, scaling sales nationally remained difficult. So Blaisdell came up with two more brilliant marketing schemes. The first was so-called punch boards, a semi-gambling lottery popular at the time. Bars, tobacco shops, drugstores, and gas stations had wooden or cardboard boards with hundreds of sealed cells. For a dime, any customer could punch out a cell with a special stylus and pull out a rolled-up slip of paper with a number. If the number won, the lucky customer took home the grand prize, a shiny new Zippo lighter. If not, they lost their dime. The bar owner made a tidy profit selling chances, and Blaisdell shipped lighters by the thousands across the country. Zippo instantly spread through the working class, moving like a virus from the East Coast to the West. The second scheme was corporate branding. Blaisdell understood perfectly that the flat metal surface of a lighter was a perfect advertising billboard. One a man would pull out of his pocket 10 to 20 times a day in full view of coworkers and acquaintances. The first major corporate client was the very same Kendall Refining Company from Blaisdell's hometown of Bradford. In 1935, Kendall ordered a batch of 500 lighters bearing its company logo, a raised hand with 2 fingers, symbolizing its famous 2,000-mile motor oil. The logo was engraved on the brass case and filled with colored heat-resistant enamel. The lighters were given to top executives, key clients, and top long-haul truck drivers. The experiment was a phenomenal success. Following Kendall, a line of industrial giants formed at Blaisdell's door. Oil companies, steelmakers, railroads, tire and machine tool manufacturers all wanted their logo on a lighter that never breaks. Zippo became prestige corporate merchandise decades before marketers even coined that term. By the end of the 1930s, Zippo Manufacturing Company was standing firmly on its feet. The company moved into a larger new building, expanded its machine shop, and production volumes exceeded hundreds of thousands of units a year. It seemed the business had settled into a calm era of steady prosperity. Then came December 7, 1941. The Japanese air attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into World War II. Harsh times of total mobilization descended on American industry. The U.S. government created the War Production Board, which imposed the strictest rationing of all strategic resources. All copper, zinc, brass, nickel, and chromium were declared critical war materials. Private companies were categorically forbidden from using non-ferrous metals for consumer goods. Everything went into shell casings, ammunition, radio equipment, aircraft engines, and tank armor. For Zippo, this meant a death sentence. Lighter cases had always been stamped from high-quality, deep-drawn brass, a copper-zinc alloy, then chrome-plated. No brass, no lighters. Most small manufacturers of accessories and haberdashery simply shut down or retooled to make buttons for army long johns. But George Blaisdell made two epoch-making decisions that would permanently write the Zippo name into world military history. First, he stopped selling lighters to civilians completely, 100%. From late 1941 to late 1945, not a single Zippo reached the shelves of civilian American stores. The entire output of the Bradford factory was contracted to the U.S. War Department and directed exclusively to Army distribution centers, the Post Exchange, PX, military store system, and naval bases to supply the active-duty military. Second, Blaisdell solved the brass shortage. If non-ferrous metals were off-limits, that meant making lighters from whatever was in abundant supply. And what was abundant was low-grade, secondary, cold-rolled carbon steel. Stamping cases out of steel turned out to be sheer hell. Steel was far harder than brass. The stamping dies wore out much faster, and the corners of the blanks cracked during deep drawing. But Bradford's engineers retooled the presses and achieved stable, consistent geometry. But then a new, far more dangerous problem emerged. Unlike brass, plain carbon steel with no protective coating rusted in the open air, in wet trenches, under pouring rain, and in salty sea mist in a matter of days. Chrome or nickel plating was impossible. That was strategically banned. Ordinary paint was pointless. In a pocket alongside keys and ammunition, it wore off within a week. Then Blaisdell found a unique technical solution. The steel lighter cases began to be coated with a thick layer of black epoxy phenolic enamel and baked in industrial ovens at high temperature. During thermal treatment, the paint polymerized, contracted, and formed an extremely tough, rough, matte, textured coating, covered in a web of fine cracks and bumps. That's how the legendary Zippo Black Crackle was born. This finish turned out to be ideal for war. First, it protected the steel from corrosion completely. Second, it was rough and didn't slip in a soldier's wet, muddy, or bloodied hands. Third, and most important at the front, the matte black surface produced no sun glare whatsoever. A flash of sunlight off polished metal could give away a position to a sniper from a kilometer away, while a matte black crackle lighter was invisible. Over the course of World War II, the Bradford factory produced and shipped millions of these lighters to the front. Zippo became the standard, indispensable companion of every American infantryman, paratrooper, sailor, and bomber pilot. At the front, the lighter instantly outgrew its status as a utilitarian device for lighting Lucky Strike or Camel cigarettes from K-rations. Under the war's extreme conditions, the Zippo became a universal survival tool. Soldiers used it as a field burner, Removing the insert, or simply opening the lighter, they'd heat canned meat, soup in a mess tin, or boil a cup of coffee over its wide, stable flame in the trench. They used it to light dark bunkers, dugouts, and aircraft cockpits. Its flame was used as a signal beacon to gather a group at night. Military mechanics used it to thaw frozen fuel lines and carburetors on Willys MB Jeeps and Studebaker trucks during the freezing winter of 1944 in the Ardennes. In field hospitals, military surgeons and medics sterilized scalpels, needles, and forceps over a Zippo flame before removing shrapnel and stitching wounds when no sterilizers were available. The famous American war correspondent and Pulitzer Prize winner Ernie Pyle, who followed the infantry through the entire war from North Africa and Sicily to the Normandy landings, devoted entire columns of his frontline dispatches to the Zippo lighter. He wrote that the Zippo lighter was in greater demand among the troops than any other piece of gear, that it was truly the most coveted item at the front, because it worked in any weather, in any wind, in pouring rain, and that soldiers would trade almost anything for one. Asked what had kept up their morale in the mud of Europe, he would name dry underwear and a Zippo lighter. Blaisdell himself personally corresponded with hundreds of servicemen. Ernie Pyle regularly sent Blaisdell the addresses of soldiers who had distinguished themselves, and Blaisdell, at his own expense, mailed them engraved personalized lighters at the front. The future U.S. President, then Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in Europe, General Dwight Eisenhower personally wrote George Blaisdell an official letter of thanks, noting that the Zippo was the only lighter that never once failed him throughout the fighting, calling it a superb example of American engineering reliability. But there was another, darker side to this wartime story. For hundreds of thousands of young men, this little black box became their last link to home. Sitting in wet foxholes before an attack, soldiers used bayonets and nails to scratch their names, their home states, the names of their sweethearts, dates of battles, and the names of Pacific and European islands into the rough black crackle surface. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Omaha Beach, Bastogne. Sometimes the lighter literally saved a life. The company's museum archive in Bradford holds dozens of lighters donated by veterans and their families, with pistol bullets and mine fragments still lodged in their steel cases. A lighter carried in the left breast pocket of a soldier's field jacket, right over the heart, stopped the lead and saved his life. When World War II ended in August 1945, millions of demobilized soldiers came home to the United States, and every one of them carried in the pocket of his army uniform a worn, soot-stained, scratched-up Zippo. Blaisdell no longer had to spend millions of dollars on advertising to prove his lighter worked. An entire generation of victorious fathers, builders, workers, engineers, and businessmen of post-war America simply knew. There was nothing better in the world than a Zippo. It was a colossal reserve of trust that elevated the company to the status of a national institution. With peace restored, the Bradford factory immediately returned to noble brass. Wartime restrictions were lifted. Production was modernized. The lighters once again began to be polished to a mirror shine and chrome-plated. But after the war, the company faced an unexpected quality crisis. In late 1945 and early 1946, complaints started arriving at the factory. On some new lighters, the striker wheel stopped producing sparks after a few months of use. George Blaisdell didn't sweep the problem under the rug. He halted shipments of finished product for 3 months, brought in his best metallurgists, and found the cause. The steel supplier for the wheels had changed its heat treatment process, and the metal was no longer hard enough to work properly with the new flint compositions. Blaisdell spent $300,000, a colossal sum for the time, nearly the company's entire annual profit, developing his own proprietary steel hardening process for the wheel and retooling the heat treatment shop. From then on, quality control of the flint wheel in Bradford became an absolute cult. In 1947, Blaisdell decided to remind America of his brand once more and created one of the most outrageous and eye-catching promotional vehicles in history, the Zippo car. He bought a luxurious dark gray Chrysler Saratoga sedan for $3,400 and handed it over to a specialty coach building shop, Gardner Display, in Pittsburgh. The body was radically rebuilt. 2 giant brass Zippo lighters, each about 2.5 meters tall, with hydraulically operated removable lids, were mounted into the central section. Huge neon tubes protruded from the windscreens, mimicking living flames, and chrome Zippo emblems adorned the hubcaps. The car cost the company a staggering $25,000. Throughout the late 1940s and all through the 1950s, the Zippo car drove hundreds of thousands of miles, visiting all 48 continental U.S. states, appearing in parades, fairs, exhibitions, and auto races, delighting children and adults alike. The brand had firmly worked its way into America's cultural code. In the 1950s, the Bradford factory made another fundamental innovation that, decades later, would drive millions of collectors around the world to distraction: the bottom stamp date coding system. Originally, the stamps on the bottom of a lighter served a purely utilitarian legal and manufacturing purpose, stating the brand name, city of manufacture, Bradford, Pennsylvania, and the active patent number. But starting in 1955, factory management decided to introduce internal batch tracking to monitor manufacturing defects and die wear. Small marks, invisible to the average buyer, began appearing on the bottom next to the logo. Combinations of dots. In 1955, 4 dots were placed on each side of the name. Zippo. In 1956, 1 dot was removed. Zippo. In 1957, 2 dots on each side, and so on until the dots ran out. Starting in 1966, the system was updated, replacing dots with vertical dashes. Zippo. From 1974, the dashes were tilted to the right, and from 1979, tilted to the left. And from 1986, the company switched to an elegant, transparent alphanumeric code still in use today. A letter of the Latin alphabet from A to L is placed to the left of the logo, denoting the month of manufacture: A, January; B, February; C, March, and so on through L, December. To the right of the logo goes the year: Roman numerals from 1986 to 2000, 2 through 16, and from 2001 onward, familiar 2-digit Arabic numbers: 01, 02, 23, 24. The ordinary buyer, purchasing a lighter, never even noticed these tiny symbols on the bottom. But for the growing community of collectors, this became a sacred grail. These stamps let you determine, with absolute precision down to the month, the birth date of any lighter that has rolled off the Bradford line over the past 70 years. In 1956, the company expanded its lineup and introduced the Zippo Slim, a narrower, thinner, more elegant version of the classic lighter. It was positioned as an accessory for women and businessmen who wore slim 3-piece suits and didn't want the bulk of the classic model bulging out of a vest pocket. The Slim housed a smaller insert, but the operating principle, windproofing, and lifetime warranty remained untouched. By the early 1960s, it seemed the world had finally recovered from its wars, and an age of rock and roll, television, big-finned cars, and cloudless capitalist paradise had arrived. But the geopolitical standoff of superpowers in the Cold War era was preparing humanity for a new, bloody nightmare. And that nightmare was destined to unfold in the sweltering, impenetrable jungles of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War. If World War II had been, for Zippo, a war of national recognition and industrial achievement, then Vietnam became a war of personal drama, soldierly despair, psychological breakdown, and the most remarkable phenomenon of trench art in human history, the so-called phenomenon of Zippo trench art. In Vietnam, every American soldier, Marine, and Special Operations Trooper carried a Zippo. The jungles of Indochina were a place of horrendous climate, 100% humidity, endless monsoon downpours, swamps, mud, leech-infested rivers of the Mekong. Not a single paper matchbook, not a single newfangled gas lighter lasted more than 2 days there. They got damp, clogged with mud, and stopped working. In these conditions, the Zippo was the only reliable way to start a fire, light an explosive charge's fuse, pry open an ammo tin, or dry out a damp detonator. But in Vietnam, something unprecedented happened. Unlike World War II, where soldiers fought for a clear and understandable cause, saving the world from Nazism, in Vietnam, 18 to 20-year-old kids found themselves dragged into an incomprehensible, brutal, exhausting guerrilla war on the other side of the world, where death could come from behind any bush, and the local population hated the outsiders. American soldiers began turning their brass lighters into personal diaries, manifestos, confessions, and cries from the heart. In Saigon, Da Nang, Nha Trang, and right outside military bases, hundreds of self-taught Vietnamese engravers sat along the roads with primitive gravers, drills, and chisels. For $1 or $2, or a couple of packs of cigarettes, they would engrave any drawing, map, unit emblem, or custom text a soldier wanted onto the shiny chrome cases of American lighters. These engravings became a mirror of the psychological damage endured by the Vietnam War generation. They fell into several piercing categories. The first category was the black, cynical, gallows humor of men who had made peace with the possibility they might not come home alive. Bitter one-liners about being unwilling draftees serving an ungrateful nation. Dark jokes recasting scripture in a soldier's voice. And grim jabs at faith and fate. The second category was existential longing for home, lost youth, and loved ones. Lines about loving someone now because tomorrow might not come. About Bradford, Pennsylvania having made the lighter while Vietnam made the man. And running countdowns of the days left until rotation home, crossed off one by one each evening. The third category was pacifist and anti-war protest. Peace symbols, crossed out M16 rifles, and lines borrowed from the songs of the era's counterculture musicians. However, in this war, the Zippo name also became linked to one of the conflict's darkest and most tragic chapters. The term Zippo mission or Zippo raid entered official and semi-official U.S. military usage. During search and destroy operations against enemy forces, American units would enter villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong fighters. After the residents were evacuated or relocated, the thatched roofs of peasant huts, made of dry palm leaves, were burned to the ground to deny the guerrillas their supply bases. Infantrymen would walk up to the corners of the roofs and set the dry thatch alight with the flame of their pocket Zippo lighters. American television reports, most famously CBS correspondent Morley Safer's report from the village of Cam Ni in August 1965, showing Marines methodically burning the village with Zippo lighters, shocked the American public and split society into a before and after. What's more, the U.S. Army officially applied the brand's name to heavy combat vehicles. The tracked M132 flamethrower armored personnel carriers, built on the M113 chassis and capable of throwing a stream of burning napalm up to 200 meters for 30 seconds, were universally and officially called Zippo tracks, or simply Zippos, by American soldiers and commanders. Likewise, the Navy's river flamethrower boats of the Monitor type, operating in the Mekong Delta, earned the official nickname Zippo boats. For the company's leadership in Bradford, this was a heavy blow to its reputation. A brand created for comfort and creation had become a household name for destructive military power. But that was the reality of the era. Zippo became flesh of the flesh of its time's tragedy. Today, original Vietnam-era lighters with authentic period engravings are among the most prized, rare, and expensive items on the global antiques market. A whole industry of forgeries has grown up around them, with modern craftsmen artificially aging cases and copying 1960s style engravings to sell them for hundreds of dollars. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War was drawing to a close. American troops left Saigon. The world was changing rapidly. An era of post-industrial society, high technology, synthetic polymers, and global consumer optimization was arriving. And in 1973, the Zippo company faced a threat that turned out to be far more dangerous than the wartime metal bans and the Great Depression combined. French industrial magnate Marcel Biche, founder of Société Bic, who had revolutionized the ballpoint pen market with his disposable Cristal pen, launched his newest creation onto the world market, the disposable plastic Bic lighter. It was a devastating gut punch to the entire traditional metalworking industry. The Bic lighter cost less than $1. It was light, colorful, needed no gasoline refills, had no naphtha smell, didn't blacken your hands with soot. Its case, made of tough Delrin polymer, held liquefied isobutane gas good for 3,000 strikes, and when the gas ran out, you simply threw it away and bought a new one with the loose change in your pocket. Following Bic came Japanese and Swedish giants, Tokai, Cricket, Colibri. Millions of cheap Asian piezoelectric lighters flooded the planet. At the same time, developed countries launched a large-scale government-backed war on smoking. Cigarette advertising bans were introduced. Smoking was banished from planes, restaurants, bars, cinemas, and offices. The number of smokers, the traditional core audience for lighter manufacturers, began falling by several percent every year. Dozens of the world's oldest lighter manufacturers closed their factories and declared bankruptcy. The legendary American giant Ronson, which had made superb mechanical lighters since 1897, couldn't withstand the competition from disposable plastic, lost its market, sold off its assets, and ultimately ceased to exist as an independent company. Incidentally, in 2010, the Ronson trademark itself would be bought up by Zippo. It seemed the days of the gasoline mastodon from Bradford were numbered, who, at the end of the 20th century, needed a heavy metal lighter that had to be regularly refilled with smelly gasoline from a tin can, its flints replaced, its charred wick trimmed, when a 100-use plastic Bic sold for 50 cents just around the corner. Any modern efficient manager out of Silicon Valley or a Harvard Business School graduate, in Zippo's leadership's place, would have made the one obviously correct decision. Move production to China, replace brass with cheap zinc alloy or plastic, drop the lifetime warranty to cut operating costs, switch to disposable cartridges, and optimize the workforce. But George Blaisdell, who ran the company until his death in 1978, and his daughters, Sarah Dorn and Harriet Wick, who inherited the company, flatly refused to go down that road. The company made a fundamental strategic decision. Zippo would never become disposable. Zippo would never leave Bradford, Pennsylvania. Zippo would remain a family business with 100% local production in the US and would keep its unconditional lifetime warranty. Instead of competing with cheap plastic in the utilitarian low-price segment, Zippo executed a grand maneuver. The brand moved decisively out of the category of consumable fire-making tools and into the category of cult collectibles, elements of personal style, timeless men's accessories, and enduring symbols of pop culture. And the world's film industry became Zippo's greatest ally in this transformation. Hollywood loved the Zippo from the earliest days of sound film. The reason is that film is an art of audio-visual emphasis, An ordinary plastic lighter ignites with a faceless, quiet click of plastic. The Zippo is a ready-made dramatic device. Sound designers adore that sound. The distinctive metallic clack of the lid opening, a pause, the scrape of the flint, a burst of wide, live yellow flame, and the muffled click of closing. Directors use this sound pattern to build tension, mark a scene change, or underscore a character's nature. Think of classic world cinema. John McClane, played by Bruce Willis in Die Hard, 1988, crawling through the dark, stifling air ducts of the terrorist-held Nakatomi Plaza skyscraper, lighting his way with a classic Zippo. In Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, 1979, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Kilgore lights a cigarette with a Zippo against the backdrop of a helicopter attack scored to Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, delivering his immortal line about loving the smell of napalm in the morning. In Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, 1989, Indiana Jones and his father, played by Sean Connery, accidentally set fire to Castle Brunwald using a 4-leaf clover Zippo while trying to burn through the ropes binding them. In Quentin Tarantino's cult films, from Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction to 4 Rooms, the lighter is a fully fledged character, underscoring the brutality and style of his characters. The Zippo has appeared in more than 2,000 films and TV series. And the most remarkable thing, the Zippo Manufacturing Company has never, not once in its history, paid a film studio for product placement. Directors, prop masters, and actors chose the object themselves because it feels authentic, textured, and instantly sets the right atmosphere in a shot. Meanwhile, a global subculture of collectors formed around the brand. In the 1990s, the company began officially supporting the Zippo Enthusiasts Network Club. A huge Zippo/case museum, covering more than 1,500 square meters, opened in Bradford. Tens of thousands of pilgrims from around the world flock there every year. Bradford regularly hosts international collector gatherings, swap meets, where rare 1930s and 1940s specimens go under the hammer for $5, $10, $30, and $50,000 apiece. The company began releasing limited series, lighters in sterling silver, 925, solid gold, polished titanium, solid copper. The Armor series, with case walls 1.5 times thicker, deep dimensional engraving, hand-inlaid Japanese work, rock band and Harley-Davidson emblems, artist engravings, and historical replicas of the 1935 and 1941 models. Let's step inside a modern Bradford factory to understand the physics and technology behind making this object today. The production cycle begins with huge rolls of sheet brass of a special grade, supplied by American metallurgical plants. The brass strip is fed into high-speed hydraulic stamping presses. In a single stroke, a flat cross-shaped blank is punched out, which a second and third stroke, using deep draw forming without tearing the metal, turns into a seamless rectangular cup. The bottom half of the case and the top lid are each stamped separately. The brass blanks then go through precision edge trimming, ultrasonic degreasing, and washing. The next critical stage is welding on the connecting hinge. The modern hinge consists of 5 segments, a 5-knuckle hinge. A specialized automatic spot welding machine with microprocessor control welds the hinge tabs to the inside of the lid and case. Positioning tolerance is measured in hundredths of a millimeter. The slightest misalignment and the lid will catch on the case or rattle when closing, and the sound of the click will lose its signature purity. At the same time, in an adjacent shop, the heart of the lighter, the insert, is manufactured. It's stamped from high-quality stainless steel. A brass flint tube is cold riveted onto the steel insert body, along with the hardened striker wheel, the cam lever, and the cam spring. The wick is then placed inside the insert cavity. The Zippo wick is a sophisticated piece of engineering. It's woven from hundreds of extremely fine strands of pure cotton, interlaced with ultra-thin copper wires. Why copper? Pure cotton, exposed to the high heat of a gasoline flame, chars and disintegrates over time. The copper wires serve two purposes. They give the wick rigidity, keeping it from collapsing or crumpling inside the shield, and they also act as a heat sink, drawing excess heat away from the combustion zone deeper into the insert, warming the upper layer of cotton and speeding up evaporation of the liquid naphtha. The insert cavity around the snaking wick is packed tightly with cotton balls, or a special synthetic rayon fiber prized for its exceptional capillary absorbency. A thick felt gasket is fitted underneath, marked "Lift to Fill," with a small round hole for storing a spare flint. After mechanical assembly, the outer brass cases go to the electroplating shop. There they're hung on special copper racks and dipped through a multi-stage bath, electrolytic cleaning, a barrier layer of nickel, and a final finish of chrome, either polished mirror finish, high polish chrome, brushed satin, brushed chrome, or specialty powder-coated thermal enamels, matte finishes. The case and insert are then joined together. Every finished lighter undergoes 100% manual, visual quality inspection. A craftsman takes it in hand, checks the force needed to open it, judges the ring of the click, the smoothness of the cam action, and how snugly the insert fits into the case. If a lighter doesn't produce the right sound, or the lid has an unacceptable gap, it's immediately sent for hand finishing. In a single shift, the Bradford factory produces tens of thousands of lighters. In June 2020, despite the pandemic and global crises, the 600 millionth Zippo lighter rolled off the Bradford line. Consider that number, 600 million units. Lined up end to end, that chain of lighters would circle half the globe along the equator. And now we can take a step back, take a breath, and look at this nearly century-long history from today's vantage point. So what is the true secret of this object? You know, in the modern philosophy of technology, there's a concept, the honesty of material and mechanism. We live in an age of total digital ephemerality, virtual services, and disposable plastic surrogates. The things around us have stopped being durable. Your new TV is glued together from cheap plastic and can't be repaired component by component. If a chip fails, you're told to throw the whole thing out and buy a new one. Your car is packed with disposable electronic modules, programmed to degrade once the 3-year warranty runs out. Objects have lost their soul, their weight, their smell, their tactile value. They've become faceless transit objects on their way from the factory line to the incinerator. The Zippo belongs to another nearly vanished universe. It's an object from an era when things were made by people, for people, to last for generations. There's not a single gram of glue in it, not a single microprocessor, not a single programmed obsolescence timer. Only the fundamental laws of classical physics, thermodynamics, and the strength of materials are at work in it. Capillary action draws liquid hydrocarbons up through the cotton fibers of the wick. The mechanical energy of your finger spins a hardened steel wheel. Friction shaves microscopic filings off the pyrophoric alloy, heating them to their auto-ignition temperature. The stream of sparks ignites the fuel vapor. The windscreen splits the airflow, creating a safe combustion zone. And the spring-loaded brass lid snuffs out the flame simply by cutting off oxygen, answering in your hand with that same ringing, dry, metallic click, whose sound has become, over 90 years, an anthem to human reliability. You can set this lighter on a shelf, take it down 50 years from now, drip a few drops of gasoline into the insert, spin the wheel, and it will light exactly the way it lit in the hands of American oilman Dick Dresser on the veranda of a country club in Bradford on a sultry summer evening in 1932. Because fashions come and go. Eras replace one another. Empires collapse. Entire technological ages vanish. And it simply works.